So let's get started again. Thank you all for joining us here for the second panel of the day and our last panel before the cocktail reception and then dinner. What I will do is introduce the panelists. Unfortunately, Joe Allen, who was going to be here to talk about Bidol, was unable to make it. There was an accident today. He's fine, but the accident blocked his path to the airport, so he missed his flight, and he was not able to get another flight in time to make the panel. So undeterred, we will push forward. I have opinions on Bidol, which probably surprises no one, so I will try and talk a little bit about Bidol towards the end. But let's introduce our panelists again, starting from left to right from the audience's perspective. First, we have Arthur Damerich. And Arthur, I've known Arthur for about a decade now. I met Arthur when he was the Director of Innovation in the Lemelson Foundation for the Smithsonian Institution. He is now Arizona State University's man in D.C. He's their policy man. He's a researcher. He does great work, and a lot of his research has been specifically in the pharmaceutical and life sciences area, which is why, and I heard we had the pleasure of having Arthur with us at IPWatchdog Live, and as soon as he got off the stage, I went up to him and I said, "Are you free on October 16th? Because I want you to say some of what you said here." So thank you for joining us, Arthur. We have Corey Salzberg, Corey is the worldwide head of intellectual property policy for Novartis. I got that right. I didn't demote you or promote you. I think that's accurately what you do.
I'll always take a promotion, but you got
okay,
it
right? So Corey has been joining us here in these programs for several years, and we're always happy to have him here with us today. And last but certainly not least is Emily Johnson. And Emily, I've known Emily for a long time, and we met when Emily was in law school. And Emily is now sort of the Corey for Amgen, head of IP policy and advocacy for Amgen. And I think you came the furthest. You flew in from California. So
Correct.
What we will do is we will let you have the first word. I think that's fair, gentlemen, right? So Emily, to kick us off and get us going on this topic, and the topic is going to be talking about bad policy jeopardizing drug development. What is it that you want people to focus on as we begin the conversation?
You know, I think the lowering the cost of medicines in this country is an incredibly important goal, but we need to make sure that any policy changes are carefully tailored in a way that ensures that we don't stifle future innovation. We also need to make sure that the policies are based on facts and evidence to be sure that policy changes are actually needed. You know, I think Amgen is a great example of how a company can flourish when given the right set of policies and a strong patent system. Amgen is a leading biopharma company in the world, but it got its start as a venture capital startup in 1980, and it's grown over the last 40 years to now employ 24,000 people over 100 countries worldwide. We have more than 24 products on the market, both small and large molecule, and our medicines treat serious diseases ranging from anemia, osteoarthritis, to life-threatening conditions like heart disease and cancer. The way that we've been able to be successful has been to invest heavily in R&D. We spent last year $5 billion on our R&D program. $2 billion of that was in later stage clinical development, and we make those investments at substantial risk. In our industry, over 90% of our drug candidates end up failing throughout the process, and they typically fail later in the later stages of development. So we incur significant expenses for products that never reach patients. In order to be able to make those investments, we rely heavily on strong patent protection. That is the foundation of our business model, and we wouldn't be able to make the discoveries and bring them to patients without being able to rely on patent protection.
Great. Thanks a lot, Emily. Corey, your
Yeah,
thoughts?
I think we can link together a lot of the themes we've already heard today, and we'll be talking about them throughout this panel. But the problem is, I don't think we're only in a world today where there are no facts behind policy. I think we're in a world where there's intentional actions, really, by our elected officials to push things through regardless of facts. They know what the truth is in a lot of these cases. The IRA, which we'll talk about, I think, hopefully on this panel quite a bit, is a great example, and Sherry talked about this earlier. It was intentionally called a drug price negotiation program, knowing full well that there's no negotiation involved in it, because they simply don't care about the long-term policy impacts. They care about the short-term political impacts of these things. So we'll dissect that later, but I think so. Sorry to sound so cynical, but I think we're up against much more than just misinformation. We are in a world where, again, the politics seems to be trumping the policy. And what I really think, and I'll circle back around this, in a closing thought later, but I really think we need to make sure that there's transparency. If Americans don't want the incentives in place to create new drugs for innovation, Americans are entitled to make that decision as a people, as a society. We're all part of that. But I think that we should hold our elected officials accountable to be transparent about what they're doing and what the impacts actually are going to be, and then let the people decide what's important to them.
Okay. Yeah, and that would be fair. We're going to come back to that, I'm sure. Arthur, your preliminary thoughts here. What is it that you'd like people to focus on as we begin the conversation?
Sure. So thanks for inviting me. Delighted to be here. And I think this builds actually on the two previous. So a couple big picture comments. So if we take a step back and think about healthcare systems, how we insure and how we pay for care are two different things. They get mushed together by politicians running for office all the time. They talk about healthcare reform. They tend to mean health insurance reform, not health delivery reform. But this is now something going after delivery. And if you look internationally, there's a matrix of public and private provision of both insurance and care around the world. Very few countries have the same setup. Very few countries have genuine public-private partnerships. Very few countries have people who are satisfied or happy with their healthcare systems. And no country seems to have a populace who wants another country's system. So it's kind of an interesting setup globally if you think about it that way. Healthcare absolutely has a lot of path dependency. There are historical lineages to how we've set up hospitalization, how we set up outpatient care, how we set up physicians in private practice, and how the pharmaceutical industry invests in research and discovers new drugs that have quite interesting variation around the world. And the upside of that is it does give us an opportunity to look at outcomes of healthcare reform efforts in other countries, including around pharmaceutical pricing and some of the consequences. And I think we'll get into that a bit more. Last point I would say is it does appear worldwide that everyone wants more health than they can afford. In other words, they want more health products than they seem quite willing to pay for. And that creates kind of the tension and the dilemma we're looking at. Pharma used to not be quite so visible in the US. In 2022, 6.7 billion prescriptions were filled in the United States. The pharmaceutical industry is quite visible in people's lives now. And so that's a piece of what may be behind some of what we're seeing. Last opening point, pure competition is ruinous. So we talked about in the last session kind of monopoly. When you look at what's happening in the generics industry, there's a real concern around the quality of some of the products. And it's because it's been driven down to that state of pure competition. And we used to, not that long ago, kind of be competing for the industry's presence in our country, right? This is an industry that brings very high value jobs, that is a research-based sector, that pays a lot of taxes, and that is actually a massive net contributor to any society it's in. And it's kind of striking to see if we're going to push in the other direction, what that might mean. But I'll pause there.
Great, thanks, Arthur. And there's a lot here to talk about. And maybe it would be useful to throw it right back to you, because one of the things that you said that made me want to invite you to this particular panel was about how price controls, which Corey's going to go through and talk a lot more in depth about here in a minute, when price controls have been enacted, I think, to paraphrase what you said, when price controls have been enacted, access to medicine has decreased. And that is a counterintuitive for most people, I would think. Probably not most people in this room, but most people in the world. I think if you did a survey, probably 90% or more would find that hard to believe, but the facts don't lie, right? So can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. So, I mean, the case study I was thinking about, and that was around 2011, Germany put through a new regulation, AMNOG, which I won't try to butcher by pronouncing, but basically it was a pharmaceutical regulatory piece, and it was around pricing. And Germany has a health system that's dominated by large insurers, and a system that is really seeing health as a social good. And healthcare is a piece of social provisioning in a kind of government insurance industry model. And this was an effort to kind of rationalize the pharmaceutical market and push through reform. And what it said initially, and it's been through further reforms, was new drugs can come on the market for a year, and then we do some comparison to other medicines and really try to optimize around price. And one of the consequences in how they enacted this was to say physicians can only write a certain number of prescriptions for certain drugs. So at the end of the calendar year, you had patients running around trying to find a physician who could still write a prescription for the drug they'd been on, and that worked for them. And this comes back to the earlier point in the last session. It's actually really a public good to have a lot of pharmaceuticals to treat a particular condition. And by a lot of pharmaceuticals, I mean lots of variants. So different dosages, different ways of receiving that dose, because patients have very different reactions to these. These are very powerful synthetic chemicals or biologicals, and having that variation and having a physician attentive enough to kind of titrate that and say, okay, that dosage was too strong, we'll put you on a lower dose. But sometimes it's not just the dosage form, it's other components of that medicine that have to be changed. And that's where we want that set of innovation incentives in this industry. The other one, real quick, is England, of course. So England put through the quality adjusted life year and pushed that through into the pharmaceutical area. And what happened there, of course, was then biopharmaceuticals, especially anti-cancer agents that initially extend life 3 months, 6 months, that are priced at $50,000 a month. It sounds crazy. It's not being paid for by individuals. That's what we have insurance for, but it is a cost. So England manages through delay, right? So you can ration cost through the German model of saying who can access it. You can just delay the market entry and save your system money, but it's coming at the cost of patients not getting those medicines.
Yeah. Before I turn it over to Corey, who's going to walk us through the IRA a bit, Emily, any reaction to what Arthur has said, or anything in general?
Yeah, I think he's spot on. We have seen across the world that price controls don't work, and they're typically, they reduce innovation and they reduce options for patients. And we're now seeing for the first time in U.S. history price fixing on medicines, even knowing that historical background of what other countries have tried. I think, Corey will get into more particulars, but it is not legitimate to call the IRA negotiation. Companies are forced to choose the price that's going to be set by the government or face significant penalties. And to label it as a negotiation or a fair market price is not accurate, and we need to get that message out.
Okay, great. So now, Corey, let's just jump right into it and start talking about the facts. A lot of the people in the room know this. This is going to get broadcast to a much larger audience who are probably not quite so familiar and might actually be surprised at some of what is actually true.
Right. So I'm dedicating this one to Sherry's son. And
if you were here at the very beginning, Sherry said to her horror, her son was thinking that this IRA was great. You mean we're going to control prices on pharmaceuticals? What a great idea. Why haven't they thought of that before?
Right. So I mean, part of this is, right, the government passed this law. It's part of the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which according to many economists, by the way, doesn't reduce inflation. So that gives you a clue already. But focusing in on the part of it that we're talking about here, the drug price negotiation program, there's not really any negotiation involved. And I'll explain when there is negotiation, but it's not real negotiation. At the outset, this is just a unilateral, non-negotiable price control mechanism. And what it does, it basically says, it looks at some of the most important drugs that are available today to patients in the United States, measured by, in fact, how much the government is spending on them in the collective, and we'll get back to that in a minute. But of course, that shows you that a lot of patients are actually using them in most cases. And what it does, it says if you've been on the market for 9 years in the case of small molecules and 13 in the case of large molecules or biologics, we are going to take that, we're going to look at what the current price is in the private insurance market, and we're going to start, before you even come to the table, with an automatic mandatory price cut of between 25 and 60%. So 25% off the private market price if the drug has been on the market for 12 years or less without facing generic competition at that point in time. And if it's been on the market without generic competition for 16 years or more, it's a 60% price cut before you do anything else. So let's make a simple example. If a drug costs $100, for the private market, as soon as you are eligible for and selected for this program, suddenly they're going to pay you a maximum of $75 if you're a young drug, or $40 if you are an older drug.
So I'm laughing
point one,
here
but go ahead,
because
yeah.
you said when you're selected for this program, like it's an honor. Like
Right.
this is like the Heisman Trophy goes to
Right.
Novartis.
Well, that's actually the backwards thinking here, because you are selected based on the fact that in many cases, let me give you a real example, because we are one of the first 10 drugs to be selected. One of our drugs is called Entresto. It's a heart failure drug. It's a great example of what this program is really about, which most Americans don't understand. There is nowhere in this act that actually looks at the drugs that are supposedly overpriced or supposedly not reflecting value for money. What they're looking at is one thing and one thing alone, which is what drugs have the overall highest spend for the system. So Entresto is a drug that is one of the, I think in some cases, the standard of care for heart failure. Well, who has heart failure? Most patients who have heart failure are the elderly. So the volume of patients on this drug, regardless of its cost, and no one looks at whether this is fairly priced already, that doesn't matter. The question is, what is the overall spend to the healthcare system? And if we're spending a lot on a drug, even if it's dirt cheap, if it's the overall hit to the system that's expensive, it is going to be selected, because that is the only criteria for selecting a drug. Then you get your automatic 25 to 60% price cut, and only after that does the so-called negotiation happen. But from there, it can only go one way, down, because those 25 to 60% is kind of the mandatory ceiling price. And it goes down counterintuitively based on all the things you'd think would actually keep it even at that first price. So for example, if you have patent protection left on your drug and it's selected for the program, you get your 25 to 60% price cut, and the existence of patents will force the price further down because it's counted against you. Same for whether you got any federal funding, whether you've already recouped your R&D costs. All these things actually work against you. Two other quick points about it. Number one, it's totally non-appealable. There's nothing here that you can appeal. You can't appeal the fact that you're declared eligible. You can't appeal the fact that you're selected, and you can't appeal the final price that CMS or Medicare sets for you, even if it's erroneous or even arbitrary. There's no no way to appeal. And then if you choose two other, here's the alternative. People say, well, why don't you just not do it? Well, if you don't do it, you face the so-called excise tax, which is really just a penalty that starts at, I think, 187% of your national sales, and quickly at day 270 goes to 1,900%. So I'll just end with one quick example here. The drug I mentioned, Entresto, if we were to decline the government's price, we would be facing roughly a $45 billion fine in the first year for not giving the government the price it demands. And the only other way out of this whole thing is to pull all of your products out of Medicare entirely. So basically, tell 157 million Americans, we're taking away all the drugs that we sell. We have to withdraw entirely from Medicare, which of course is totally unethical, totally infeasible. So more reasons why this is just not negotiation. So that's an overview. You can go to the other panelists, but I want to talk later on maybe about what does this mean? What are the impacts on innovation, which is what this panel is about.
So let me just follow up and ask you. I mean, do you suppose at some point in time that is what's going to need to happen? Somebody is just going to have to say, okay, well, we're going to just withdraw from Medicare, and maybe it's like in the last 6 months or whatever of protection before generic hits the market, just more to make a statement or something? I mean, is that what it's going to come to? Is that what it's going to be required?
So I actually, I mean, I don't think that's feasible depending on the size of your company and the way your drug treats. First of all, again, financially, the government has made itself the largest payer in this country by choice, right, through the Medicare system. And that's not a comment on whether that's good or bad. I actually think it's good that the healthcare system...
Just true.
Right? Yeah,
Right.
I mean, this is important, but they've made themselves the biggest customer. The problem is, of course, they also set the rules. So financially, it would be very hard to do that. But I think the other thing that does not get nearly enough airtime, I mentioned it briefly, is the ethical implications of this. No company can pull, again, I think I looked it up recently, about 157 million Americans between Medicare and Medicaid. They're, of course, not all on every drug, but you would have to pull out every single drug covered by Medicare or Medicaid from all of those patients. I don't think that's a conscionable thing that a healthcare company can do. So I actually don't think we will end up doing that. We are actually challenging this in court for a variety of reasons, which are beyond, I think, this panel. But there's a lot of really interesting constitutional problems here. But it's also just bad policy, and it's wrong. It's the wrong way to deal with drug pricing issues. And there are drug pricing concerns in this country, again, beyond the scope of this panel, what's causing them, but this is not the answer.
Right. Arthur, did I see that you wanted to say something?
I'm just struck that there's no contemplation of where other healthcare dollars go. So if you're in the hospital and you die, over the course of, say, 2 weeks of heart disease, as does happen to people for whom medicines don't work, the bill's around $800,000 to $1 million if you're in, an ICU for 2 weeks, which is what will happen if new medicines aren't available. And that's not part of this, and we're not going to talk about or care about where we spend healthcare dollars outside of pharma.
Let's just to respond quickly to that. What's very interesting, in addition to all the other negative impacts on innovation, one of the things that a University of Chicago, a set of economists there did a study on this and actually concluded that the IRA is going to increase healthcare costs by about $50 billion over the next 20 years for the very reason you just said, because we'll get to this later, but it will impact the number of new drugs that are created. And when you don't have new drugs coming out that actually replace the standard of care, that are more cost effective, that keep people out of the hospital longer, the price of healthcare overall actually goes up.
Yeah. Emily, your thoughts on this. Does Amgen have any drug currently in selection process?
We have been selected as well. Enbrel is our product, and that has been a medicine that treats a variety of autoimmune disorders. We've served over 1 million patients, and it's, I think, made huge changes. It's allowed folks who have been bedridden by certain types of rheumatoid arthritis to go back to work, become productive members of society, and because it's been successful in terms of being able to serve patients, we're now subject to an IRA negotiation, a so-called negotiation. I think it's, in terms of impact to innovation going forward, I think this is likely to have a real significant reduction in innovation related to small molecules. Sherry mentioned that those can get selected for negotiation 7 years after FDA approval, and the president's budget has proposed dropping that to 5 years. That's not enough time for a company to make investments and recoup the money and then reinvest in discovery. And small molecules are special in that they can pass the blood-brain barrier. So they can treat conditions like mental health disorders or neurological disorders that biologics cannot. So we're talking about reducing innovation on some really serious illnesses that biologics can't address.
Okay, that's a good, happy thought. I mean, none of this is happy. None of this are good thoughts. I mean, anybody that came up with this, and dropping it from 7 years, which is already egregiously short to begin with, to 5 years, it's like, I just think, well, if one is good, two is better. No, we need more of this. And it's like, It's just a bunch of people who haven't even consulted bean counters, sitting around in a room playing a game, moving pieces around a board, and it seems like it's all politics. I mean, is that what this really is, Corey?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly politics. It's also, this was pushed through on budget reconciliation, right? It wasn't actually a piece of legislation that was passed. It was passed entirely on partisan lines. And yeah, I mean, I think this is pure politics, and it was about punishing the industry for political reasons. And it was also, I think, about trying to generate revenue to pay for other things. The problem is, of course, it does have serious impact on innovation. It's worse than actually what you just said in a lot of ways, because what I think most people don't realize is that as it is right now, there are studies showing that only between 20 and 30% of drugs will actually even make back its costs. So 20 to 30% are making a profit, and of course, as Emily said, those are what are used to fund R&D, the entire global annual R&D budget for a company. The other thing that's not appreciated is it's actually the later years of sales that is what gets you over, into the black, right? So that is going to be lost here, because when you're reducing the number of years you have to actually be able to make your returns, even fewer than 20 to 30%, which is the status quo, are going to end up making any money. And the reason for that is simple. When you launch a new drug, it takes years before doctors get used to it. They start to prescribe it. They just put new patients on it, move old patients off of it. That takes a lot of time. So you're losing actually your most lucrative years, which the government would say is a good thing. But in terms of innovation, this is why the studies show, again, University of Chicago, that this is going to result in 135 fewer innovative drugs over the next 20 years, or a loss of about 331.5 million patient years gone.
So what this strikes me, and I know during our pre-call we didn't tee this up, so if you don't want to say anything about it, that's fine. I'll just give my thoughts and then we can move on. But it strikes me that rather than have an adult conversation about whether or to the extent to which we have prescriptions available for those people on Medicare and Medicaid, the elderly and the low income or no income, what we're doing is we're pushing that off on drug companies and saying, you have to take what we're paying you, and we can only pay you this because this is the only way that doing what we want to do is economically feasible. So rather than saying, and I always point to the World Health Organization has a list of 400 to 410-ish number of essential medicines. 97% of those are no longer on patent. And it's, you can do the math. It's like 390 some of these drugs can be prescribed in generic form if there's a generic company out there willing to make them. And those are the essential medicines. So rather than having an adult conversation about saying, well, maybe what we should do is guarantee people's access to those medicines that the World Health Organization has said are essential. And guess what? 97% of them are practically free. So you can have all those you want. We want to say is, well, let's take Enbrel, because that costs too much. Let's take, I'm sure Humira is on the list. It's the best-selling drug in the world, right? Take all these other drugs that we are spending a lot of money on. We don't want to tell our people, our potential voters, that they can't have that because they see that as politically not feasible. So I don't really know how this is any different than the king just telling the nobles, I'm sorry, I know you don't like it, but that's just the way it is. And we fought war to get past that kind of arbitrary and capricious decision making.
When we developed a post-World War II innovation machine in the pharmaceutical sector that actually involved a public-private partnership from the 1950s on, where what today is being criticized as government investment in healthcare not being compensated, we understood to be the role of government in supporting some of that very early stage research, and also understood that this was an industry that could get us to the point where 97% of essential medicines are genericized because they've followed the pattern. So disease keeps evolving.
Yeah.
Right? We are finding new diseases, and new diseases emerge. Are we going to not have kind of this amazing competitive engine that could develop new cures for the new diseases?
It almost seems like you all have been too successful, and you have too many choices to combat diseases that afflict a lot of people. We want to move back to a point in time when you're not so successful. We don't have all these drugs. I don't know what the end play is here.
Well, I think you said it. Well, first, to quickly comment, about the king. This is why there are lots of constitutional problems, we believe, with this, which is why many of the companies, including us, have filed suit either through associations or directly against the government, because there are takings issues, there are all kinds of separation of powers issues. We won't get into them here. But there's a lot of constitutional problems here that really stem from what's in the Constitution and why. Well, exactly the reasons you said, because that's the system was set up to prevent the government from coming in and taking property and all of that. In terms of the end game, and this goes back to my opening remarks, I think the end game is to actually reduce. The choice was made in making this, because this Congressional Budget Office itself, by the way, not as many as the University of Chicago, but CBO also concurred that this is going to reduce the number of new drugs going forward. So the calculation was made by the government that we are okay with reducing innovation over the long term to save money now. The problem is, again, that this was not transparently shared with the American people. And if you actually look at polling, this is really, I think you'll like this, Gene, because you like this kind of stuff. Yeah. The poll that is always cited in support of the IRA and other things is that if you look at I think it's an old Kaiser Family Foundation poll that says X% of Americans agree that the government should get to negotiate prices, and it's like 80% of Americans. What the government doesn't tell you is if you look further down the same poll, I think the next question is something like, would your opinion change if it would impact innovation? And that number drops about in half, I think, almost something like 40, the statistics, I don't remember exactly the numbers. But Americans don't actually agree that we want negotiation if it's going to significantly impact innovation. And this goes back to the transparency point. If you want Americans to make a policy decision to say, you know what, we're okay with not having as many drugs in the future, I think that's our right as a people to make that decision, but we need to actually understand that that is the impact of these kinds of bills, and that's not what happened here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I wish Joe Allen was able to make this today, because this would be a great segue into Bayh-Dole. I'll just say a few words. We made the exact opposite choice back in 1980 when Bayh-Dole was passed, and I had the opportunity on the 30th anniversary of Bayh-Dole to interview Senator Bayh himself, and he explained. I asked him some very basic questions, and he said, "Look, the argument that the government has already paid for this research, that resonates. It kind of makes sense, and a lot of the things that people were saying, the reason why we shouldn't do Bayh-Dole, kind of on their face makes sense, but then when you actually look at the facts, that none of these drugs that were created at universities had ever zero had made the market. He's like, well, something's askew here. Maybe we should try something a little bit different and see if that works, because the goal is to get these drugs out into the public's hands. It's the whole purpose of what Bayh-Dole did, and a requirement. And if you do have march-in rights, which constantly get misused and abused and mischaracterized, but they exist specifically so that if a drug is not being put, or any innovation, but drugs particularly, are not able to be in the marketplace, and there's somebody out there who wants them, then the government can claw back the rights and give them, so that the society can benefit from these. It sounds to me like we want to revert back to a time when we don't have as much innovation. We know what that looked like. It's a totally different philosophical point of view, and I don't get it.
So let me just pile on that, which is to take us back 50 years to the 70s. So in the late 50s, in fact, Estes Kefauver did this set of hearings into the behaviors, practices, and pricing of the pharmaceutical industry, and came up with legislation that was widely considered dead in the water for compulsory licensing, because he said the pharmaceutical industry is overpricing drugs, and they're doing it through backroom conversations, all these insinuations. And what we really need to do is have these firms mandatory license IP to each other, and then they'll make each other's drugs, and there'll be more price competition. Now that constitutional issues aside, it was basically dead on arrival. And then thalidomide happened, where this tragic case of serious adverse reactions to a medicine, and the bill got rewritten into a health and safety law, into 3-phase clinical trial, into a much more intensive FDA regulatory regime. The 1970s then, as this is implemented, was a decade in which economists, physicians, and others were writing about a drug lag. European and other countries, Japan had a pharmaceutical industry booming. European countries had pharmaceuticals before the US, and the critique and concern was there's a real problem. The Bayh-Dole was in part a reaction as well to that, and it kind of juiced America's innovation engine. By the 1990s, over 70% of new chemical entities were being invented in the US. The biotech industry grew in the US, right? So where invention happens actually relates to, in interesting and complicated ways, where the market is. And so that comes back to where we are today and what we might do unintentionally with this change in policy.
So, Emily, I'm sure Amgen's fine with all of this, right?
No, we're in litigation as part of the lawsuit that pharma filed against the government, raising the constitutional challenges that Corey mentioned. Yeah, this is a real problem for our industry, and it's going to be a real problem for patients if the IRA is not declared unconstitutional.
And I don't know that either of your companies, Novartis or Amgen, have made a public statement quite the way that some have. I think AstraZeneca's CEO has made a public statement, and there was at least one other CEO.
We've been quite vocal.
Yeah, okay. Well, maybe it was your CEO then. I mean,
Yeah.
what have they said? Because the CEOs that I've seen come out and talk about this have basically said, okay, let me just explain to you what's going to now happen. The decisions that I'm going to be making moving forward with drug discovery and drug commercialization.
Yeah, I mean, so a couple comments. And one, of course, is there's the overall impact on lower revenues means lower ability to invest in innovation and R&D going forward, which means fewer new drugs. But in terms of what this does to how the incentives change the course of innovation, that is really concerning. So number one, Emily already touched on this, but this is going to drive companies into into large molecules or biologics because of the 13-year, 9-year discrepancy. But there's no good scientific reason for that. There's nothing about a biologic that makes a better drug than a small molecule.
And it also strikes me as that's more expensive, right? I mean, because I think Sherry made the point. When you're talking about biologics, you're talking about infusions. By and large,
typically, I mean, there's lots of exceptions, but on the whole, biologics, I think our R&D is more expensive because they're more complex on the whole.
So why? Why? I mean, that seems to fly in the face of everything they're trying to do. They picked you two and 8 other drugs, right? And because we spend too damn much money on these. I mean, are they just going to say no? Medicare is not going to cover biologics, or what are they doing?
I mean, I think there's a misperception that for the point you just raised. While small molecule drugs are cheaper, so the impact won't be as much. But they don't need as many years. The problem with that is just not true for a lot of cases. I'll give you a real example. We have a drug that called Leqvio that is a small interfering RNA-based drug. So it's based on biology, but the piece of RNA is small enough that under the definitions of small molecule versus big molecule in FDA speak, it qualifies as a small molecule drug, even though it's actually biologically based. That will get 9 years instead of 13. We have a field called radioligand therapy where we're attaching radioactive particles to a little ligand to target only cancer cells and leaving the healthy tissue around a cancer mass unscathed. That is some of the most complex medicine out there. It's incredibly hard to work with. It has a half-life of like 48 hours or something, this stuff. Incredibly difficult to make and administer, but it's a small molecule, so that will get 9 years. All of these fields are going to be completely disincentivized, and companies are going to say, well, even though scientifically or medically this is the direction to go, we can't afford it. We're going to have to push things into the large molecule space. So that's one thing. I'll stop and have some others.
And is that like, okay, so let me dial back on my own question here, because I would see that to be just being completely and totally rational, right? I mean, if you tell us we can get 9 years small molecule and 13 years elsewhere, well, 13 is larger than 9. It's a pretty simple math problem, right? But by pushing in that direction into the biologics, that's going to be more expensive for the government ultimately, right? Or is it just that, or maybe I'm missing something, or is it just that fewer people are going to be able to actually take biologics, so they're going to save money that way, or was there any thought as to like, well, if we do this, it's going to cost us more in 10 years, or?
To my knowledge, there was none of that thought. I mean, this got thrown together and, like I said, passed really quickly in a non-conventional way through Congress and pushed through on a partisan basis. I don't think there was a whole lot of understanding of what was even in there by most people, but maybe you know more. I mean,
I don't know more. My quick hypothesis would just be, if you look it up quickly online, what you tend to think would be, okay, large molecules, anti-cancer drugs, we still want to have those, so we'll give it a little more time. Small molecule, kind of everything else, heart disease, okay, there's plenty of those out there. The companies seem to be doing fine with it. Let's go after those with a shorter time. I mean, if you were just Googling stuff, you'd kind of, that'd be halfway rational at least.
I think Sherry had a comment over there. Yeah.
Aren't 8 out of the 10 drugs that are selected small molecules? And doesn't that in itself give a message?
So Sherry's question, just for those who will view this later on, it said, aren't 8 out of the 10 drugs selected small molecule drugs?
Yeah. I think that's right. I mean, that I haven't looked at that specifically, but my assumption is there's lots of reasons for that. I mean, number one, biologics are newer. Number two, because it's 13 years versus 9, there are more small molecule drugs that have been on the market for 9 years than there are biologics that have been on the market for 13. There's probably some other things too, but yes, I mean, so far the first round is heavily skewed against small molecules, for sure.
So, Emily, what is this going to do to Amgen's development? I mean, have there been any public statements or things that you can share with us, or internal discussions that aren't necessarily private?
Well, I can tell you that it's our CEO and company has explained that it's forcing us to make really hard decisions on which projects to move forward with. And Pharma recently conducted a survey of its members, and I thought some of these statistics were enlightening, maybe also alarming, that 78% of the pharma member companies say that they're canceling early stage pipeline projects because of the IRA. 63% of them said that they expect to shift R&D investments away from small molecule medicines. 2/3 of them said that pipeline projects for new medicines that were planned to go forward will not move forward into clinical development. So, they're all of these already. We're seeing that potential new medicines are being abandoned as a direct consequence of the IRA.
And can I just add one more impact that we haven't touched on yet, and maybe you have some thoughts there too, Emily, from Amgen's perspective, but it's also going to just kill any incentive to do research into new uses for existing drugs, because we depend right now, I mean, many drugs out there, including some of the most groundbreaking standard of care drugs, were drugs where the molecule itself might have been used for a different disease, but it was later, through additional R&D spend and investment and lots of work and effort, discovered that a similar pathway is implicated in a different disease. That happens most often later on, towards those last few years of life that's left in that drug. And under this scheme, you basically are going to face that price cut right at the time you would have done that research. Why on earth would any sound investor pour money into a drug that's about to be subject to a price cut? And by the way, just to make clear, if you get this drug approved for a new use, it does not get to reset. It's based on the molecule itself. So if it's the same molecule, even if it's a totally different formulation for a totally different purpose, administered into the body a totally different way to treat a different disease, too bad, you still get that price cut. So this is going to also just kill that whole direction of research, which is so critical to so many patient groups.
Well, let me ask you this, and this may be asking for a prediction that you might not want to make, and that's certainly fine, and we can move past it, but it strikes me that when you look at this, there are going to necessarily be a not insignificant number of pharmaceutical companies that are going to ultimately go bankrupt, because the science is what the science is. You can look and look and look and try, and even the best companies out there strike out 9 out of 10 times when you're in this area, right? So now, where you make money is, in the last few years, and not only in the last few years, but if you have a drug candidate that has gone through all the trials, and now it's been in the market for a decade or so. You have great information about the tolerance of the populace taking that drug. So now, if you have some reason to believe, well, you know, maybe that drug could do X, Y, and Z, you already know the drug is safe. And now you move into that space, and there's an additional resource of revenue coming in, not to suggest that we're expanding patents the way IMAC suggests. Patent life is patent life, period, the end. And you guys don't even get 20 years of term because of the FDA. But at the time when it's most valuable and potential to take these very safe drugs that we have great data on and move them into other uses, that's not going to happen. And you're already striking out 9 out of 10 times. And then you're getting vilified for the one grand slam you hit. You know, I mean, I used to, when I growing up, be a Mets fan. There was a guy named Dave Kingman. Some people will probably remember. The guy either struck out, popped the ball up straight a mile, or he hit a home run. And there's a lot like that in the farm. Although he was, you know, one of 3 he did, or he walked. He walked a lot because they would walk around him. You know, I mean, you guys don't even have Sky Kingman's statistics. It's going to cause a lot of the industry to go out of business, I think. Am I missing something?
I mean, I think that's a possibility. You know, there's, again, I mean, 13 years, we have to see. I mean, some drugs, 13 years is kind of where we are on that. For small molecule drugs, that's about where the average is now, between 12 and a half to 14 and a half years, if you look at, you know, systemically over a couple of decade periods. The biologics, I think, are currently at about 15 to 17 years, although what we don't know is, you know, a lot of that is due to the fact that there was no pathway for biosimilars until 2015 effectively. It was enacted before that, but it was not up and running until 2015. So the question will be, you know, is 13 going to be enough for some of these biologics? Maybe some, but I think you're right that certainly some of the smaller companies, you know, are not going to be able to survive. As we know, the rest of the world already doesn't pay a fair share of costs. So I think that's a real possibility for some companies. And if nothing else, it will, as we already said, force us to reduce the number of drugs that we're willing to invent and the amount we're able to invest in R&D. So it's a lose-lose for patients.
Yeah.
So on that
Go ahead,
point,
Arthur.
if this becomes a replay of the 70s, yeah, you'll see a reduced R&D spend, and all the consultants will tell the industry to diversify. And so in the 70s, pharmaceutical firms bought up, you know, consumer healthcare. They were into cosmetics. They were into perfumes, all of which they kind of shed in the 80s and 90s as they saw that, you know, pharmaceuticals alone was a great business and needed that focus in research. It turns out there's not actually a lot of research cross-pollination between pharmaceutical discovery and perfumes. But, you know, we may end up with an industry that's kind of diversified in ways that it hasn't been in 4 or 5 decades.
So I want to ask this question about lifestyle drugs. And I don't know whether any of you know, or maybe somebody in the audience might know. Does Medicare pay for Viagra? I don't think they do.
I mean, it's off patent now.
Well, I know, but
For
that,
one thing, but,
I mean that type of drug,
right.
you know. So, and the reason I bring that up is because, you know, when we had these conversations about trips, you can bust, quote unquote, bust the patent in with the drug if it's life-saving, right? Well, you know, it is a very important part of life, certainly, and I'm being very serious here. Yeah. You know, these lifestyle drugs are very important. I don't want to minimize the importance of that aspect of life, but if you're going down that path and you're creating the next best Viagra, Cialis, whatever, they're not clearly not life-saving within the meaning of trips, and they're not going to get busted. And I thought, well, you know, if I was a pharmaceutical CEO at this point, when we were talking a few years ago about trips is always busting through trips has always been an issue. It gained steam even right prior to the pandemic, and then through the pandemic, a lot of steam. I thought, well, I would look at my portfolio, and if I'm going to adjust my portfolio, I would start looking at maybe lifestyle drugs, or at least drugs that are not, quote unquote, life-saving. Yeah. And then I hear what you guys are talking about here now, and you know, they pick the 10 drugs that they spend the most money on, and if and then there's a lot of drugs that they don't pay for, right? Because they're why wouldn't you just focus on those drugs? And I just don't think that that's the policies that we should want. We should want the exact opposite. Rather than incentivizing lifestyle drugs that can't be busted, it should be the drugs that are the cure for cancer in a pill, the cure for heart disease in a pill. Those are the drugs that we want to incentivize. And those ought to be the ones that can't be busted so that we get more of those and give more incentive. And it just seems backwards to me.
And we did this with the Orphan Drug Act, right? We, in fact,
Yes, we did.
in a clever way,
Very
designed
successfully.
a set of incentives. And the U.S. is now the place that invents drugs for diseases that are extremely rare.
And companies can make money doing that. I mean, they don't make a lot of money. They don't make nobody makes Humira money. I mean, that's an unfair comparison. But I mean, they can make enough money to pursue orphan drugs, make sense. And that was a great policy. And those who aren't familiar with the orphan drugs, I think the cutoff is 200,000 people or less suffer from this disease. And that's a marketplace that pharmaceuticals just would ordinarily not be able to service. But with the orphan drug laws, they do service it.
So it's interesting. There is an exemption in the IRA for orphan drugs, but only, and this is the problem, right? At first you say, oh, well, that's great. Somebody actually thought about that. But it's only if the orphan drug is approved, actually, I think, indicated for one indication. And if it's any more than one indication, then suddenly it all gets put back on the table. And of course, that's exactly the opposite to your point of what you want to do. If you have an orphan drug that treats 100 patients, and it turns out you suddenly discover this is also good for these 500 patients over there, you want to incentivize that, but this actually says don't do it, stick with the 100, because as soon as you do it, you're actually going to be subject to price controls, and you're going to actually make less money than you did with the 100 patients over there. So these are,
That's
to your
just
point,
crazy.
completely nutty. It makes no sense in terms of let's think through the policies that we want to achieve. It's all about, seems like, more punitive nature than actually thinking through what do we want to incentivize.
Yeah. Emily, I think I sensed that you wanted to say something when Corey was talking.
Yeah, I think Corey covered it, though. It is kind of ironic that our orphan drugs are carved out from the IRA because the incentive is to go, just work on discovering treatments for very small patient populations, and it's essentially discouraging treatments that are successful and treat some of, the most serious diseases we have in this country. And I don't think we want that as a society. That's not going to help us lower our overall healthcare costs.
So let me ask you, any of you on the panel might want to tackle this question dealing with what is it that we should be doing? I mean, what is the policy that we should be pursuing in order to maximize innovation of the drugs that we want the most? And I'll throw while you think about that, your potential answer to that question, I wanted at least to raise during this panel, not that drug patents last too damn long, but that they don't last nearly long enough, right? I mean, if we're worried about how much these drugs cost, then maybe we should, for the ones that are really successful, give more exclusivity so that the company has the ability to recoup their money over a longer period of time without generic competition. And I think we're just going about it the exact wrong way. So what would each of you like to see? And obviously, I'm not going to ask you to take a position on behalf of Novartis or Amgen. If you want to take a position on behalf of Arizona State, you can. But just on your own, any thoughts, Emily?
Yeah, I would think I would at least guarantee a 20-year patent term for any drug, and then allow for patent term extensions for treating very serious diseases where the drug is providing an extra benefit to society. And I think that would encourage companies to go after the big killers. And give them an incentive and give them a financial reward for making important discoveries.
Great. Corey?
Yeah, I mean, so to start on the back end, I mean, I do think drug pricing is an issue in this country, and we have come forward as an industry with what we believe the solutions are. I mean, these are things like going after the pharmacy benefit managers, all these middlemen structures that are jacking up the prices, through the rebate type system, because it's a broken system. Going after the abuses in the 340B system, again, beyond the scope of this panel, but these are what hospitals use to kind of get drugs at cost for certain populations that deserve that, but they're abusing it to kind of, make money off the top. All of these different factors have been ignored largely until there's some activity now about it. They've been ignored, and there's a misperception that all of the money that's on a list price of a drug is somehow made by the drug companies, but that's not true. So if we want to get to drug pricing, we have to deal with that. If we want to your point, get to healthcare spending, which is about 90% of the overall healthcare spend, whereas prescription drugs is like 10%, we need to deal with all of that. That will deal with the drug pricing aspects that this purports to deal with, because this won't help there at all. And then for the innovation side, I totally agree. I mean, we need to make sure that we're at least getting, a reasonable period to make our money back. I'm not sure it has to be exactly 20. That would be nice. I think right now, again, we get around 12 to 14 on small molecules, 15 to 17 on biologics. And as it is, as I said, 20 to 30% of drugs make back their money, and the other, 70, 80% don't. So again, I'm back to my opening statement, which is Americans need to be aware of all this. They need to be educated, and they need to make a choice. Do we want to sacrifice, the long-term innovation and the availability of new drugs for short-term price cuts or not? And that's the debate we have to have, but we should have it openly.
So I was smiling because as you were talking, I was remember a situation personal that I just found just impossible to understand. It was when we had changing healthcare policy. There was a certain drug that I was taking in generic form, and the insurance company that we were going to would not cover that. And I'm like, well, what am I supposed to do? And they're like, oh, well, we'll cover the brand name. Okay, so you'll cover the brand name, but not the generic. Okay, well, that's just idiotic. I mean, until you realize, and I don't know that this was a PBM situation, it probably was, there's somebody behind the scenes throwing levers to make that economic decision make sense, whether it's a kickback or whatever it may be. And I don't know it to be a kickback. I probably shouldn't have said that. That's a word with a lot of, but there's something going on behind the scenes that doesn't meet the eye, because no rational decision maker would say, we will not cover the generic. We're going to force you to take this brand name drug that's much more expensive. And so there's all these different incentives in the background that nobody really understands. And that is a big problem. Arthur, do you want to?
Americans did benefit for years from insurers competing not on their ability to bring price down, but on having larger and larger formularies, because they could go into large employers and say, look at everything we cover.
Right.
And in a way that had a lot of upsides, even if, health economists looking narrowly at that one piece of the healthcare spend would say, wow, this is a little bit crazy, because they're not competing on what we typically expect competition to be about. To your point about, what would we do if we could do anything policy-wise? Yeah, I've for years liked the idea that patents have some variable term length related in part to the severity of the disease or the absence of other treatments. And so, yeah, reward the key discovery with additional time. And if you can reward it with additional time, maybe you don't have the $50,000 a month price that people viscerally react to, whether or not they are actually paying it,
Right.
which they really aren't.
Well, and I think several years ago, and I don't know that they still do this, but several years ago, Walmart figured this out. I'd like to see more private sector solutions. And the way I say that Walmart figured this out is they came out with, if you get prescribed one of these, and I think it was around roughly 400 different drugs, that they would sell you a certain number of pills, whatever the number of pills was, for $4. And it's like, that seems like a pretty good idea. I mean, if the government thinks that drugs are the problem, which they're not, they're a small piece of their overall spend, then maybe they ought to do something like that. I mean, or think more creatively. But jamming your demands down somebody's throat is nothing other than punitive. And we see it when it's others doing it to us. But for some reason, the government doesn't see it in this situation. I know we're right at the 6 o'clock hour, and at the risk of going into the cocktail reception that's going to follow, I did want to ask you all if you wanted to just very briefly tackle this. The government has already paid for this. I mean, because that's just simply not true. I mean, the quick answer is there's a lot of money that goes into basic scientific research, and then taking that scientific research and getting it into a product that the FDA will actually approve and for the marketplace takes a decade or more, and many hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. And there's a term called the Valley of Death, where those familiar with the technology transfer world know the government gives you money to do the basic scientific research. Then on the back end, once you got a pharmaceutical company that's interested in this, they'll start doing the research necessary to get it through the FDA. And then there's in the middle, there's usually no funding anywhere in the middle. You got to incentivize somebody to do funding in the middle, and you got to squeeze the basic research into something that's close enough that the pharmaceutical companies want, and that's the valley of death, right? Where there's no funding potentially to get over the hurdle. So this total fiction that you've already paid for this. Did I get that right? Is there anything to add?
I mean, there's a few quick things I can say. I mean, number one, about 75% of all drugs are still fully invented by the private sector with no federal money or input whatsoever. Number two, of the rest, and this is all, there's studies that show all this at another time we can give you if you want to post them or write about them. But
The answer to that is yes.
Okay, good. You know, I mean, the rest of them, I think we've already said it, but just to say it a slightly different way, I mean, most of this research is on basic science, meaning things like identifying a new target on a cell in a body that wasn't known, a druggable target, not research on a drug to actually drug that target. They're two completely different but complementary things. Of course, we can't create a drug for a target that we don't know about, but it really is a totally different kind of research. And the last quick point I'll make is, again, lots of data on this, but the magnitude. I think the NIH, I forgot what it is, they spend like $8 billion a year or something on R&D. That's less than we spend as one company. We spend $10 billion a year. I'm sure Amgen is close to that too. I mean, so it's about 1% of the spend of the private sector is what the government spends. So there's all the misinformation, all the false narratives that's driving all this. It's absurd.
Yeah.
So
Go
to your
ahead.
point, real quick, the people who make that criticism should be forced to read an NDA. So new drug application to the FDA. I've read a couple cover to cover. I'm crazy, good enough. But you know, the pharmacokinetics, pharmacodynamics, the experience of different patients taking it, the extent of animal testing. I mean, it's really remarkable what we ask of pharmaceuticals before we put them on the market. And if you think that's what universities are doing, you have no idea what's going on.
You never spend any time talking to anybody at a university or in a lab at a university or even in the technology transfer department. It's not what happens.
Right.
Yeah. So Emily, I'll give you the final word. If there's one thing that you hope people remember that maybe is a point of conversation during our happy hour, what do you want that to be?
Let's not take pharmaceutical innovation for granted. Just because we've had success over the last 40 years does not mean that it's going to continue if we make these policy changes.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I thought that was a wonderful panel. Thank you all.
Thank you.